Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Cathedral Commons here at St. Mark's. And I see some faces that weren't able to be here last week. We are glad that you're here. No worries about that. We'll do a brief review. We also have some handouts of the slides from last week. If anyone needs those, I hand out to you. Does anyone else need a copy of last week's slides? Let's open with a word of prayer. The Lord be with you. Let's pray. Be present with us, O Christ, your servants, your saints here. Open our hearts to your spirit of forgiveness, of wisdom, of grace, of love and forbearance. Help us to know the work that you have called us into as holy work, as the deep spiritual work of life, as the source of healing and peace. In all of it, may we be given courage to engage it with a sense of purpose and grace. We ask it all in your holy name. Amen. Well, again, thank you all for being here. The second of the 3-week series. We'll do a brief review of what we covered last week. We have slides from last week if you didn't get those. And then we'll have handouts for this week's slides. And then next week we'll wrap around with the conclusions. And so tonight we're going to unpack the path to forgiveness, this fourfold path that Archbishop Desmond Tutu developed and used during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and has since written several books on it, and really espouses it, teaches it for all of us, even in the midst of our daily lives where forgiveness is a necessary part of our work as well. Next week we'll be looking at how we seek forgiveness and the challenges that come with that when we wrong someone else, and we'll look at how we work to forgive ourselves even when we don't feel like that is warranted in certain situations. As is always the case with the Cathedral Commons, on Wednesday evenings we provide the space for conversation at tables, and later on in the evening in a paired up situation with the invitation to begin to share in a more trusting way, in a more vulnerable way even, because we believe that that's who Jesus calls us to do, and that's the work that Jesus calls us to do. So by way of summary and an overview of the 3-week series, we're engaged in the question, why are we called to forgive? What is forgiveness? What is not? We hang tight with the scriptures which call us into this work time and again. The prophets, and in particular Jeremiah, says very emphatically that the path of forgiveness is the way back to God, that in order to have that wholesome and fruitful and life-giving relationship with God, we have to understand that God is a forgiving God, and that the work that we have as God's beloved is the work of forgiveness as well. We have a model, this fourfold path, Tutu's model, to move away from the revenge cycle that we're so familiar with and acculturated to, and into a forgiveness experience. We'll unpack that more tonight. We are inviting each other and us as a community to engage the deep work of finding the challenging opportunities of forgiveness, and how do we engage them with courage. And then, as we said, next week we'll focus on how to practice forgiveness of oneself. We're working off of 2 presuppositions for the series. One is that there is nothing that cannot be forgiven, and we can debate that if we need to. And the second is that there is no one who is inherently undeserving of forgiveness. Either of those stop you short? Any problems with that? All right, come on, folks. I have problems with that. I believe it, but I have problems with it. Does that make sense? Yeah. For those of you who heard the sermon last Sunday, the invitation to ask the question, who is on your list that you would determine is unredeemable by God, and by extension then unredeemable or unforgivable by you? And shared a poem that I've gotten lots of feedback about, including a few emails today of folks that just were deeply moved by the ballad of Judas Iscariot and the notion that even Judas would be welcomed by Jesus the bridegroom into the eternal banquet of the feast. Is there anyone on your list that would be unforgivable? As I said, Jeremiah proposes that the way back to God is the way of forgiveness. We talked some last week about the work of lament, that lamenting is something that we've lost our voice in modern time, but we can only have to look at several of the scriptures, and in particular several of the Psalms, to really regain that voice, reclaim that voice of lament, and know that it's what helps us stay honest with one another and with God. And when things aren't right, to declare that honestly to ourselves, to others, and of all to God. Yeah?
Can you tell me again what lament is?
Yeah. Lament is not just complaining. I mean, I might want to complain that I went to get my car serviced and they lost my appointment. I had to wait extra long, and then they fouled it up and they said it would be $36 oil change, and then they charged me $80. Or I'm making this up, but and I can complain to the world's end about the unfairness and the frustrations that come with that. That's not lament. Lament is orienting to the other in a way that says, and in particular God, that says, God, this is not right. The world is not right the way it's operating. When people are having their money stolen out of their cups on the street, where they are just trying to get a few pennies to be able to get some food in their bellies, and someone comes along and beats them up and takes what little they have. The invitation is for us to lament. And in the language of the Psalms, the lament is with full voice. How long, O Lord? How long will it be this way before you're going to do something about it? Or to even say it with anger. Someone earlier was talking about, where is anger in the work of forgiveness? We can't deny the fact that when someone wrongs us, we have a natural reaction of anger in the midst of the hurt, and that's perfectly fine as long as we don't get mired and stalled in it in a way that we bog down there. And by the same token, we can be angry with ourselves when we screw up. So anger can have a role, but the anger of lament is one that is demanding that God show up and do something different. And when I say demand, the expectation is that the relationship God can handle anything that is truly, sincerely, and honestly on our hearts.
So lament is both, like when you say about the sense of this, the person whose money's stolen from their cup, we're lamenting something that's happening to an other, but we can also lament things that happen to us.
For sure, it could be about the experience that you are having that you feel is unjust, unfair, unreasonable, or that you're seeing it being played out in the world. But the energy of it is in the relationship that says, God, you got to do something about this. I expect you to do something about this. If you read the Psalms, it is, this is not right. How long are you going to let it go like this? And of course, the invitation is for us to engage the work with God, to say, we don't want to allow it to continue this way either. We've got to have it different. And the invitation of lament is to wake us up and to be honest with it, but honest in the sense that we are expecting it to change. And we're willing to work for that. It's not just complaining that I got done wrong and mired in or wallowing in the complaint and the frustration. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Yeah. The point is that we really have a difficult time getting to the path of forgiveness unless we're able to lament what has been done wrong. Catherine?
It seems, as you describe lament, it seems to me that outrage is inherent. So something is inherent, that outrage that this is not right. There's an element of outrage in that.
There is an element of outrage. It also may be an element of a weariness or an element of compassionate heartache. How long, O Lord, are you going to let people die on the streets of Seattle? How long, O Lord, is the world going to be driven off of the notions of power or prestige or fame, or whatever the case may be, instead of the qualities, the virtues of love, and forgiveness, and mercy? We haven't even really unpacked mercy. It's not within the scope of this, but if we really stopped to unpack mercy, it's not just having a pity for someone. It's not that. It's saying the relationship is so connected between what you're experiencing and how I experience that I can't engage you without the sense of wanting to relieve that with you. And especially if I have some capacity to offer that relief. Which is why we say God is this merciful God, because God has, if you go through the scriptures, the scriptures aren't these things that were written 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. Yes, they are. But the scriptures are our stories. I would challenge you, pick up and open the Bible to any book and read it. Read it with the invitation to see it as an allegory or as a parabolic invitation to see how it plays out today. And I would say that there is nothing in that Old Testament that's not being played out today. We don't like some of the stuff that's there. But I'm telling you that it's all here today still. And so the invitation is for us to see it as our story and to lament the ways of the world still. It would make sense, at least here, that with civilization progressing, that humanity had evolved to be gentler, more merciful, more loving to one another. But we only need to look at the last century and to see that we've killed one another more in the last century than in all the centuries combined. Over 100 million. Over 100 million. So, all right, you guys got me worked up, right? So
the honest part of this, and this may just be the way I deal with my own emotions, but this sense of honesty, you were saying, like, when in association with mercy, that it's almost like you have to be honest with yourself and admitting how you feel. Like, if you're hurt, you have to not only say you're hurt, you have to kind of revisit the feeling of being hurt. Is that part of the lament?
it is. We're going to get to that. The experience of the hurt cannot be denied if we're going to work this path into forgiveness. That we have to acknowledge the pain in a way that culture says, don't acknowledge it, push it away, don't deal with it. And what we're invited to do is to say, no, the pain is real. It's going to bubble up somehow. It's the old whack-a-mole thing, the the whack-a-mole, you hit the mole here and it pops up over here. You hit it there, it pops up over here. It's going to manifest in your life one way or another. The pain is. But if we're willing to bring it to the surface, honor it, be honest with it, then we can move through the rest of it. So, I was going to say one other thing about lament, but I've lost it now.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Do you think God laments? Is there examples of?
Oh, thank you. That's what I was going to say. You only look at any of the books of the Bible, and you find there are, in every one of them, God has the opportunity, the full-on privilege and rightness to destroy humanity out of punishment for what we've done. But in fact, what happens is every time that's the crisis point. Crisis means fork in the road, the judgment. God always turns and says, but if you'll just come back, I'll let it go. We'll do it over again. And then turns, and on down the road we do it again. And God has every right to say, you know what? You have breached this relationship so many times, I am done with you. Doesn't mean that we don't suffer the consequences of those breaches. We do. We always suffer consequences when we breach relationships. But the invitation is always there. That's back to the sermon. The forgiving God always has the arms open for those that are willing to come back. It's always there. Which is why we can say, no one, not Hitler, not anyone, is beyond is eternally damned to a point that God is finished with them. Now that's, as I mentioned in the sermon on Sunday, that's gotten priests excommunicated, inhibited. Not in modern times, I don't think. Well, it got Rob Bell kicked out of his church, right? Love Wins, the book Love Wins. But if we don't believe that's who God is, then why are we doing this, folks? If we don't believe that's who God is, why bother with this? And of course, the invitation then is, it's not our place to judge. You know that that's the case. Because we're all in this together, and we're all being invited by a God that forgives and forgives and forgives and forgives. We're being invited to model that in our lives too, because God knows, and Jesus taught us, that that's the path to healing and peace. And without it, we will not experience peace in our lives, in the world, globally, or communally. We will not do it if we're not able to forgive one another. And I can tell you story after story after story of church communities, congregations, who fracture over something and are not able to hear one another to a point where they can forgive. And those congregations disintegrate every time. It's not just church, it's any. All right? All right, we're going to get to tonight's subject matter still. We mentioned last week several citations of the science that those who practice forgiveness more intentionally experience several positive indicators in their health, everything from lower blood pressure to lower incidence of anxiety and depression, higher incidence of joy and pleasure in life, and so forth. So you may recognize that photo or that poster that I have brought down from my office. It's Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal Son, drawing on the parable of the prodigal son, which incidentally, the two parables we heard last Sunday of the lost sheep and the lost coin are actually intended to be a trio, a triad, with the parable of the prodigal son. They're all in the same chapter of Luke, and they're intended to be taught together, but because the parable of the prodigal son is so long, the Sunday lectionary splits it out. But the invitation is to see that everyone in those relationships, familial relationships, are being invited into the practice of forgiveness. And we do it in different ways. The son for the father, the elder son for the brother, the father for the son who went prodigal, and on and on. If you haven't read the book by Henri Nouwen, that's a reflection on Rembrandt's masterpiece, which hangs in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, Russia, I would encourage you to read that book. Who here has read Nouwen's book on forgiveness, Return of the Prodigal Son? All right, so put that as part of your homework, if you would.
Is that the title?
Return of the Prodigal Son, yeah. He basically gets, Henri Nouwen, the late Roman Catholic priest and theologian, gets, I think, a full month of private time with the masterpiece in St. Petersburg, Rembrandt's masterpiece, and he sits with it with different light action through the course of the day. And what happens is, as you know, Rembrandt's colors are so layered and so dark that it ends up giving dimensionality or perspective in the painting. And so there are actually a person here, we're not sure who that is, but now one reflects on who he thinks it might be. And then a woman back here next to the column, and then another face back here, another woman. And who are those women? Was that the mother? Was that a sister? Was it a servant? We don't know, but the invitation is to reflect on how the community works toward forgiveness. So forgiveness is not an invitation to forget, or an invitation to minimize the injury, or an invitation to pretend the relationship is just fine. It is about speaking the truth. Forgiveness is not a practice of weakness, even though culturally we're told that if you give in to the infraction done to you, then that's a sign of weakness. Actually, I would say that forgiving is much harder than holding the resentment. It's not a subversion of justice, because as I said, people always live with consequences. The justice may take a different form, not retributive, but restorative. And it is certainly, and most certainly, not easy. And it's not about denying the truth about what happened. So forgiveness is an invitation to acknowledge the perpetrator's humanity and the fact that you share that in common. It's an invitation to claim your humanity with that person. It's an invitation to find healing and peace. In Tutu's dialect, the word used to talk about forgiveness is actually about, I want peace with you. I want forgiveness, I want peace with you. And what does it mean to let go of the grudge? So the fourfold path. And I modified the right side of this from last week just to hopefully make it a little less circular. But if we're moving from the left to the right, where the left side are the habituated practices that we're taught and that we are acculturated to, then if we begin, I know it's hard to see on your paper, but if there is violence or cruelty done, then there is hurt or harm or loss experienced, which exhibits as an experience of pain. And the pain is most often in our culture, we're taught to suppress it or to push it back out. And if someone caused me pain, it gives me right to cause them pain back. And the circular practice of vengeance or retaliation really never satisfies, or if it does, for not very long. And there's all sorts of science that says that vengeance doesn't. And yet, it's what we just naturally lean to when we're done wrong. And then it turns back into violence again, and the circle carries on and on. And this is the way that wars are started, right? But if we acknowledge the pain and see it as an opportunity to heal, then we can move to the right side, which is the fourfold path of forgiveness that we're going to unpack now, which is to tell the story and to name the hurt, to recognize our shared humanity, granting forgiveness, and then renew or release the relationship. So we're going to unpack that all together. But let me say just some general statements about this fourfold path. One is, even though I've created it as kind of a cascade there, it's not always linear. It's not always clear what kind of a timeline it's going to take. For some things, it may just be boom, 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 boom. Yeah, let's move on now. And for others, it may be a lifetime of working toward forgiveness, or of forgiving another person, or of experiencing forgiveness given you. It's not always predictable in how it comes. Some parts may come easily, other parts difficult. It's okay to say, I need more time before we engage in the real work of forgiveness at that stage, or I'm not there yet. And when we are the offending party, we need to honor and hold the space for the victim, for the one harmed, to be able to say those things and know that it's okay, not to pressure them. Deborah?
There has been, in my experience, kind of a precursor or preliminary element of courage, that it takes courage in the concrete, and then faith, because it's such an open-ended. You may forgive somebody and they may blow you off. It's not, like you were saying, it's not transactional.
Yeah.
And so I think even going into it, kind of agreeing with God of, I may get screwed in this process and feel worse than when I first, but I'm going to trust there's a bigger picture.
Yeah.
And that this process is spiritually based.
Yeah. I hope everyone was able to hear Deborah that it takes courage to do this work, and oftentimes it's an act of faith to step into it, because it may not play out the way you hope. The person may push it back in your face, they may walk away, they may refuse to even talk, or they may say, I'm not there yet, I can't go there. And what do we do with someone who doesn't want to engage the work with us, or isn't able to? We'll talk some about that more next week than tonight, but let me also say that Archbishop Tutu says, the work of forgiveness is your best self-interest, is the best work of self-interest you'll ever do. Because the work of forgiveness is about your own healing, whether or not the person on the other side of things experiences the healing as a result of the forgiving work or not. So that should stop us short a little bit, because self-interest is an ego-driven statement, but I don't think that's what he means. I think he's saying the work of forgiveness is about your own healing. And hopefully it's about the work of the healing for another as well. But it's always about your healing. And you don't have to receive the forgiveness from the other in order to experience the healing of doing the work on your side of things. It helps, but it's not required. All right? So, first part then, telling the story. We tend to think that being honest about painful experiences is problematic or even frowned upon. We're told that why would you let it bubble up and be honest with it? Just push it down, suppress it, deny it, project it on someone else. It can be risky to acknowledge and hold the pain, because it can re-traumatize from the experience. It can also victimize the one whom you might be sharing your traumatic story with. It might be, let me just give an example. If I'm a victim of child abuse, sexual abuse as a child, and I choose to share that story with another person whom I trust, but it traumatizes them, their own experience of sexual abuse as a child, it can be traumatizing to them, it can victimize them. It's not to say don't do it, it's to say beware of the ways and the risks inherent in sharing the pain. The suffering can become consumptive. We can also fall into a victim's narrative in which it is just really hard to figure out how to get out of that dark hole if everything in life is defined by the experience of being victimized. I'll say more about that in a moment. It can also be liberating, though, to tell the story. And I would suggest that there's a cost to not telling the story, to bearing the burden alone, or it's a stumbling block to the healing that we've talked about. Does this make sense? The next slide, truth-telling with our children. There are several studies there that suggest that what seems intuitive to us, which is to protect our children from the darkness of our lives and the dark parts of our narratives, is actually counterproductive to their resilience, their experience of health as well. Emory University's been doing a lot of this research. The children who know their family history, the good and the bad, are more resilient. Marshall Duke said that those who know the family story, that's the best single predictor of children's emotional health and happiness in his research. Children after September 11th, those whose family members were victims of 9/11, they studied, and the more that they knew the truth about what happened to their loved ones, even in the utter rawness of that, the more resilient they were. And Dan Siegel, the neurobiologist, says the more clear and coherent stories parents share about their lives, including the traumas, the more positive, loving relationship children will have with their parents. And I think the inference in all of this is that children are great bullshit detectors, right? They know when we're not telling them the truth. Does anyone else have that experience with their children? Why do they hold back the truth from our children? Surely, at some level, we don't want to cause them harm or angst, right? But is there also a piece of shame that comes with it? That we don't want to share that our lives are not perfect? Are not perfect, not past tense, but present. Thoughts on that? Yeah?
I think sometimes the sharing, I think about my own childhood, things that were shared with me, had more to do with my parents not wanting to admit the situation to themselves, even.
Yeah, it's a fine point, Reed. So sometimes the parents don't want to admit the thing to themselves or to each other, and so why would you share it with a child that's going to have to sort that out when the communication's not flowing between the parents? Is that, yeah?
Yeah, or that they're not even admitting it to themselves, like there's
Yeah.
denial and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, Mary.
I really like that word there, coherent, in the Dan Siegel quote. I think sometimes because we know we have no understanding of our messy life, or some part of it, we don't have a coherent understanding.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to communicate in a non-damaging way an incoherent understanding of your, or story, incoherent story of your own life. And I think people just go into sort of wordless, they don't know what to say.
Yeah.
And I think what you do, perhaps you can just say, gee, look, this happened, I just don't get it.
Yeah, which is, Marilyn, thanks for making that point. And it's also to say, this is not working out your stuff on your children either, right?
Yes.
I mean, this is not figuring out how to tell the story by telling it to your children and letting them suffer through something to a coherent story.
Hopefully not.
Yeah, right. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah. Just a few more notions about telling the story. We have to recognize that there are two types of memory. There's explicit memory in which we remember the memories, and then there's the implicit memories that are down in there, and they're working on us, but we're just not aware of them because we can't remember them in the same way. So I remember eating the delicious soup that we just had. What I don't remember is what was going on over at the table with the children here. But I know that that impacted me as a part of my experience of eating dinner in here this night. I'm using that as just a really kind of a silly example, but we have both. We have experiences that we can't bring to the surface in a conscious way, but we still need to be aware that they're working on us. Right? Does someone have a hand up?
It's on your other thing. Why isn't there a coherent story? And I think I can understand in my parents wanting to interrupt the cycle by not sharing it and thinking that that is saving me the work or doing the work for me. But in fact, I'm the only one to do the work.
Yeah, did y'all hear Sandra? Sometimes the parents are wanting to break the cycle that they've experienced and that their parents experienced, and by not sharing it is a way to bury it. But work of Rabbi Friedman, and Murray Bowman of Bowen Family Systems Theory, says that systems don't work that way. We can try to bury it, but it will find its way back to the surface, whether it's ever spoken or not. And we know that to be true in congregational systems. That's the work of Rabbi Friedman that sometime I'll teach a class on when I get enough courage to do so. It's powerful understanding to think of congregations in similar ways to family systems, and to recognize that the things that, let me just name it the things that we have dealt with as a community of St. Mark's through the decades continue to present themselves. Different players, different setup, different set of circumstances, but they continue to mount over and over and over again because we've never really historically, and I say we, let's go back 2 decades or more, we've never really dealt with, honestly, what are those problems and how do we understand them? I think the people that were here and stayed through the long interim between the last dean and when I arrived in 2012, I think you did a lot of that work. And now we're trying to figure out how do we break the cycle, but we keep it in front of us in a way that we're aware that deans and musicians like to pick fights with one another at this place. I mean, y'all are laughing, but I mean, I can go back to the first dean, John McLaughlin, and tell you about the stories. I can go to the third dean, Dean Leffler, and the fourth, and the fifth, and the sixth, and now on the seventh. And what I'm telling you is that Michael and I have this in front of us at all times, because neither one of us want to fall into that trap again. It's not guaranteed that we're not going by any stretch, but we're trying to raise it to a level of, why do we want to go back and do that again? Just makes sense. Yeah. It doesn't. That's not the only one. We can talk about the myth of grandiosity and the ways that St. Mark's does this, that, or the other, and where we do that faithfully and where we do that as an ego-driven enterprise. And we could go on and on. You shouldn't hear from me beating anyone up here. This is not at the feet of any individual. This is systems, folks. This is the way the systems work. Our parents, when we tried to bury it and not share it with our children, they were doing the level best they could. And the invitation for us is to hold the space for them in a forgiveness model to say, they were doing the best they could, and I want to honor that. Just, anyone want to push back about that or say foul? Does it make sense?
I want to rebut at the end of that.
What's that?
I want to rebut at the end of that. Like, you can honor that, but I want to do it differently.
Well, that's the work, is to do it differently, and over time, we'll exorcise those systemic viruses, let's say, that are going to crop up. It's not any individual that has caused that. It's a system challenge. It's this in family systems too. Every family has them. And the work that we have, this is why I want to do the work with Friedman's work, is that we can overlay the work of our family systems of origin, and we all know those stories, whether they were told to us or we intuit them, and the work of the system of St. Mark's, and know how those things play out in all sorts of ways. Y'all have got me all off kilter tonight. Deborah and Mary, and then we're going to move on because we got to have some time to share.
This may be too big a question for here, but maybe you know somebody that's addressed it. At what point do systems get repeated and embedded enough where they become a culture? And how like,
Yeah, so how do they get embedded, repeated? What was that?
Not all systems are bad.
Right. How do they get repeated? repeated enough that they become a culture. It is a big question to unpack what is culture and how do we define the elements of culture, but let me just say there is always culture in every system. Always culture in every system. The ways, the rituals that we come to understand meaning with, the language that we use to confer, the understanding of who's in and who's out of those systems, we always have a sense of culture in every system that we're a part of. And not all of these are bad. I was using a couple of examples of ways that I really want to do it differently, and I think we are trying to do it differently here at St. Mark's, but to recognize that there's beautiful things about systems as well, which is what came from over here. So, yeah, Mary?
I was thinking about the phrase, they're doing the best they could, we're doing the best we could. And it seems like it's dangerous, that phrase is dangerous in that it could make it so then there isn't an issue because nobody was meant anything wrong. They were doing the best they could. That somehow it also takes some guts if you're the one who's offended and you know that your parents say we're doing the best they could, then how do you get to forgiving them for doing the best that they could?
Right. Yeah, thanks for saying that. And I appreciate the opportunity to clarify some. It's not by saying doing the best they could, it's not a pass off or a put down. It's a statement of compassion in which we want to hold the relationship in a way that we can forgive when they didn't. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but my parents weren't perfect. That was a joke, folks. All right, let's pause and look out and look at the sunset. So, my parents weren't perfect, but I can tell you that on my mother's deathbed, without her being able to say something of apologizing for the things that she did and had always been a point of separation and brokenness in our relationship, that I was given a gift of forgiveness in that moment that I can't describe. I didn't ask for it, I didn't work for it, she didn't ask for it, she didn't work for it, and yet somehow the Spirit got the two of us together enough to be able to say, it's okay. Not what you did is okay, or what you failed to do is okay, but it's okay here in this moment, and we'll sort it out in the eternal banquet hall in a way that we can be together in this moment and not worry about all that other crap that ensued through life. So that's what I'm talking about, is the opportunity to work into the forgiveness by holding the fact that I can have compassion for her and the stuff that she dealt with in her life. Does this make sense? All right. So the summary of the practice of the process of telling the story is you've got to speak the truth. This isn't sugarcoating it. It isn't making light of stuff. It's speaking the truth, starting with the facts. Set aside as much of the emotion as you can initially and start with the facts. It will help you find your way into the story. Tell a friend, a loved one, a trusted person before you go and engage the person who has wronged you. Consider telling the person who wronged you, or if you can't do that, write a letter and then accept what happened, that it cannot be changed. You're not wanting to go back to the way it was before. You can't undo what was done. The relationship, if it exists, if it's renewed, will always hold this encounter as a part of the experience of that relationship from henceforth, including, hopefully, the forgiveness and the deepened relationship that can happen as a result of that. All right? So then secondly, naming the hurt will always find expression. As I said, the whack-a-mole model is that if you suppress the hurt, it will mount as shame, or it will mount as resentment, or as misery, or as victimization, or there's fear, or there's anger, or there's feeling excluded, so forth. The neurobiology, as we mentioned last week, is that the part of the brain that's activated for physical wounds the one that's activated for psychological or emotional wounds is the same part that is activated for physical wounds. Our bodies understand that this is important stuff. Grief is a part of naming the hurt. This is not an invitation to deny that grief, because anytime loss happens, there's grief. We have a tough time in our society, in our culture, of really raising grief to a level of awareness for anything other than very substantial loss, like the death of a loved one or the death of a pet. We have a tough time understanding loss of a job or a graduation of a child. A joyful event can also bring on grief, or the focus of retiring, or turning a beautiful age on another birthday can bring about grief, even in the midst of, I'm having a good time in this life. Does this make sense? So grief will always occur, not just with physical loss, but also the loss of trust, faith, innocence, or just any sense of loss. I would caution you on Kubler-Ross's, y'all know Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's landmark study from the late 60s on the stages of grief: denial, anger, bargain, depression, acceptance. That was research done at the University of Chicago, specifically on people who had life-limiting illness and were in the terminal phase of their illness. And she was studying what were the stages of grief that they went through. It was never intended by Kubler-Ross, and she actually wrote a book later saying, stop using my research for application for all other forms of grief. If you're the one who just lost a loved one, these may make sense to you, but she never intended those to be used that way. And what we know is that the 5 stages of grief that she described so eloquently almost never happen in a sequential, linear, and predictable pattern. And the more modern research finds that the overwhelming majority of people, 96 to 98% of people, when they experience significant loss and grief, the bereavement science says that 96 to 98% of people have the built-in resilience to not need to work phases or stages in a protracted and owned way, just need to acknowledge the fact that there is loss, and now what does life look like in the wake of that. And I don't want to minimize that, but just to say that we've got to be honest about the pain that we're experiencing. All right? Speak the truth about the hurt, which brings us back to telling the story again. Be aware of your own vulnerability. Move ahead only when you feel like you're ready to do so. Let me just highlight, when you're listening to someone, the work for you, someone who is sharing your pain, the work for you is to listen actively and respectfully. It's not to fix anything. It's not to offer advice. It's not to bring your own stories of grief or loss into it. It's to hold the confidentiality because it's their story, not yours. It's to just be present with love and care and compassion and empathize with them. I think you all know all of that. So then, granting forgiveness. This is probably, even though the first 2 are really hard, this is the one where we often get smashed, because we have to be conscious about choosing forgiveness on whether we're on either end that we're on with that. Forgiveness is a choice. It won't just happen by the by. It has to be intentional. We are invited to recognize the humanity we share with one another. The Dalai Lama has this great meditation in which he breathes in and he breathes out, and he calls it giving and taking. And when he has someone that feels like an enemy in his life, he breathes, let me find it, he visualizes his positive emotions, and he visualizes their negative emotions, and he tries to set aside his negative emotions and when he's identifying their negative emotions, it could be hatred or what he called poisons, hatred or fear or cruelty, he breathes those in and he sends out his positive emotions of love and compassion, happiness, affection. And he goes over and over again until he's not breathing in any of those poisons. And in the exhale, he's offering to the world, because that person is never just an entity unto themselves. He's offering to the world the positive emotions. Does this make sense? Giving and taking as a meditative exercise. Only say you're sorry if you mean it. Again, folks can intuit when it's not a heartfelt sorry, when it's not true. And the false or tentative apology will not lend to the healing the same way that a true one will. It gives you an opportunity then to reframe the story, to tell a new story, to move from the narrative of victimhood and into one with new agency, new joy, new compassion. Often will become a deeper relationship as a result of this work, even. And then lastly, to renew or release the relationship. The invitation is always to renew the relationship unless it's not safe to do so or it's not possible to do so. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But renewing is not restoring the relationship that was there before. You're not going back to something that was there before. It's identifying a new opportunity in the relationship informed by this new story, this new narrative that we share. The new relationship is always informed by the suffering and forgiveness. As I said, it often means a deeper relationship comes with more honesty. It acknowledges the shared humanity and telling the story in the relationship, but it must always be truthful. It's not about forgetting it or passing it under the rug or pretending that it really wasn't that bad after all. And when that's not possible, to release the relationship, when you can't stay in the relationship without causing more harm, when it's not safe, you may not know who it was that even harmed you, or they may be dead, or there can be some intentionality in releasing it, and even still that allows for the healing that can come. Now, I have somehow misplaced my slide about the invitation for table conversations, and y'all don't have it in your slides either.
I don't see it.
All right, I apologize. So at table conversations here for just 5 minutes or so, this was supposed to happen back before, and I apologize, we had some glitches with the computer earlier today. I wanted you to share at your tables, as I said, for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to have some sharing in tandem on something else. But at your tables, have a conversation about why you feel that forgiveness is so difficult, or is it? Or secondly, why do you think that the vengeance theme is so prevalent in our films, in our plays, in our books that we read? I know we have some that speak of forgiveness and of reconciliation, but on the whole, if we think about it, you go to Netflix, you watch 10 movies, 9 of them are going to be about vengeance. So why is that? Why do you think that's such a prevailing motif in our culture? Would anyone like to share anything from your table conversations? Okay, if you don't, I just want to make sure that I'm doing.
Well, at our table, we spent a bit of time talking about the second question, which was this, the cultural fascination with revenge. Like I said, any number of movies will have that theme. And we kind of, not came to the conclusion, but we thought there's something primal about those stories, about one wrong person who tries to avenge whatever happened. And it just taps into almost a survival instinct of striking back, of hitting back. And it's not a recent phenomenon. I mean, G was here and he quoted the line of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's been around for millennia. And throughout centuries, the variations of those stories, even throughout Shakespeare and opera, have always continued that idea. So maybe we'll never be fully rid of that theme of somebody seeking revenge, either in fiction or in real life. But that was our conversation mostly on why that theme is always there in media.
Thank you. And yet Jesus says, I tell you, not an eye for an eye.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Let's see if I remember what I was just going to say. There was comment on our table, just about all of us here, from the Woodstock generation. And how, and my, one of us mentioned that that movie came out very recently on Woodstock. And we noticed how back in that day, the movies in general seemed a little gentler to us, that there was less of the violence that we see today represented in such abundance, and how it just seemed to escalate over time. And I wondered if that could be due to the nature of the cycle that you described, where when there's hurt, it's just like it's exponential, right? And so now it's like it's portrayed everywhere.
Yeah, certainly trying to inflict pain in the wake of pain only causes more pain. What's that saying? Something about gouging the eye out of your enemy will only end up making the world blind. How did Gandhi say that?
Yeah. An eye for an eye.
Eye for an eye.
Makes
Leaves the
sense.
whole world blind. Yeah, leaves the whole world blind. Thank you. So, yeah. All right. Well, let's now turn. I intended to have that a little bit earlier in the evening. I apologize. But now let's turn to the sharing 2 by 2, and the questions that I have for you as prompts. You can do these. You can choose one. You can go a different way if you want. But the 3 that I have is, which of the 4 steps of this forgiveness model is most difficult for you, and why is that? Or can you think of a time when being honest about the pain or hurt or loss has been especially difficult? A time when it's been especially liberating? Or how would you express lament for a situation or experience in your personal life? And how would that help frame the story that could lead to forgiveness? All right. So let's take about 10 minutes now, just 2 by 2. And you need to spread out a little bit, you certainly can. Make sure that you have time to both share in that 10 minutes. Yeah. All right. Does anyone like to share anything that you, not the other, would want to express?
Well, I can share with her that I made a commitment to my children to have my genetics tested when my mother passes away. And it was interesting how you said how important it is to the children. My children want the truth of my life. So I have agreed to do that. And I think it will be very freeing for all 3 of us. So, I've pretty much forgiven her as much as I can. I'm going to have to do the rest of it at the great table in the sky because God's got a referee. But, for now, I think I've gone as far as I can.
Yeah.
But I do want to know, to allow my children to have the truth.
Yeah.
So, that's my part.
Good. Thank you. Anyone else? Sandra?
I think for me, the first question, what's the most difficult to really grapple with? And it's renewing or releasing a relationship, because relation is so important to me. And saying no to a relationship that I need to do it for myself, or I need to just let it go, that's really tough.
Thank you for saying that. And let me name that there are different motivations for when to renew or release. Those of you who know me well know that I'm an Enneagram type 8, and I can release relationships like that. That's not a good thing. But others might hold the relationship that needs to end, even at great potential for harm for someone, for them. And I mean, we all know stories of that where folks stay in relationships that just really are not life-giving and need to get out for whatever reason they stay. And there's a whole range of spectrum in between those. So being aware of when and why we renew or release is an important part of the work. Yeah, thanks.
Just another renewal story that just happened today. It was astounding for me. Usually dysfunctional family, lovely, colorful stuff. And I had a younger brother, and we were quite close. And I went to Europe my senior year. He was 6 years younger than me. He converted to Judaism, and we had difficulty figuring out how to bridge that conversation. I'd been there for his baptism. I, had seen it. And about 10 years ago, we both grew up enough to have the hard conversation because his wife said, "Your brother needs you." And it turns out all these years, he had been resentful and said, the first words out of his mouth were, "Why did you leave me alone?" And it never even occurred to me. And I had an opportunity to say, "I am so sorry." I was so lost in my own fog, that I didn't even realize. And the reason it's a special story today and coming to this class tonight is because I spent 2 hours on Messenger with his wife because I've been invited to Yom Kippur and trying to figure out. And all of a sudden I went, oh my gosh, this is too big a God story. I don't think I can even take this in. So just there are lots of stories of not releasing, of releasing, but just the blessing of we were both willing to go to the scary place, tell our stories, exchange that, pay the cost of going to that scary place. And I'm going to be sous chef for Kugel, It's pretty cool.
That's great. Yeah, I would say in all the years I practiced hospice medicine, the greatest gift of hospice was nothing really about the physical symptoms. I mean, it's important, but it was really creating the environment for the relationships that have been broken to be restored or reconciled, or to come at peace where it can, and to do that work. So, one or two others.
I'm beginning to understand that where I have trouble getting to forgiveness is possibly because I haven't grieved enough. And is lamenting and grieving, is that the same thing?
Thank you for the question. Is lamenting and grieving the same thing? They're connected, but they're not the same. How to say it in a nutshell? Grief is the experience of loss, and lament is the expectation that things will be different. And the way they are now is not acceptable. So they're related. I don't know if I have to give some thought. Maybe I'll try to communicate some next week about how to distinguish that a little better. But the notion of lament is orienting to say, let's change this. It's a statement of agency that says it's not where it is, and we need to do something different. And we meaning God and me in the world. If we connect them in the sense of saying that in the one that we all experience at one point or another, the death of a loved one, we are in the midst of grief in the wake of that because of the loss that's there. But there may also be this sense of lament of this isn't fair that I've lost my loved one. God, I want to experience life in a different way. And I know that that's how you want me to experience it. It isn't that loss of the loved one is the problem. It could be that it's unjust that they died or were killed, but the wake of that, the grief is there, but the lament is saying, I want the life-giving experience of joy back, which is part of the path to get to that experience of joy again. Does that make sense? Yeah. Anyone else want to say something about lament? Because it's hard, because we don't know. If you'll Google Walter Brueggemann, costly loss of lament. He's got a great essay. It's about 5 or 6 pages long. Costly loss of lament. He says it as well, much better than I ever could.
I feel that, at least in my experience, grief can be described as reactive. That something has happened and I react in grief. And then lament can be then a transition from reaction to action.
Yeah.
Here I am, this has happened, I'm reacting, what am I going to do about it? And it's not just finding a solution, but you know what I'm also going to do about it is I'm going to lament.
Thanks. All right, Catherine, briefly, and then we'll close up.
Okay. It can't be brief.
Save it for next week then, if you would. So next week, as I said, when we need forgiveness, how do we do that? For ourselves, forgiving ourselves, or asking forgiveness of others. And the homework assignment that I would invite you into is try practicing the Dalai Lama's meditation of giving and taking, as I described it. The breathing in the poisons of the relationship with someone whose relationship that you have is broken, and breathing out the positive emotions as you're able. Or journal about an experience which you've not been able to forgive the other, and think about why that is and how could it be different, and so forth. All right. If you have opportunity to help me break down the tables and chairs, great. If not, no worries. We'll be back same bat time next week, same bat channel. Thank you all. Blessings.